Welcome back to the bottom line up front on our Artorias podcast. I'm Matt.
And I'm Stefano, the Chief Intelligence Officer of Artorias. And in today's episode, we are going to be focusing on Africa, and specifically in some of the hotspots that we've seen spread across the African continent and conflicts that continue to intensify. With the latest reporting that we're getting to start off this episode is related to Mali, in which the Al Qaeda affiliate in West Africa, known as JNAM by their acronyms, appears to be pressing an offensive that might target the capital city of Mali. And we might be in a scenario where Al Qaeda, for the first time, might seize a world capital, and this time in the African continent. JNM continues to press the offensive near Bamako, the capital of Mali, and appears to be right outside of the capital city, indicating that JNM has intensified their strength and that the Mali military, led by the junta, and more importantly and broadly speaking, the Alliance of Sahel States, or known as their acronym as AES, has not been really able to halt their offensive and reduce the territorial control. Nor are we really seeing the Africa Corps, or basically the Russian mercenaries that succeeded Wagner, really able to stop JNM's offensive. And I'm very glad that we have Matt, our resident expert in a lot of these conversations, joining us today. So, Matt, I want to ask you this question. Before we recorded, you kind of alluded to kind of a shift in JNM's strategy. But the question I think that is in everybody's mind is JNM having their offensive target Bamako? And is there a scenario where maybe an Al Qaeda affiliate might actually control a capital city for the first time in their history?
So, I don't think that is going to be the case. And from sort of what I've seen, a lot of the analysis doesn't point to that being the end goal. What seems to be the goal is rather to destabilize the current junta and to also create a level of unpopularity in Bamako that will potentially lead to unrest. And it seems like the goal is either to legitimize JNIM as a political actor, to have negotiations, maybe even some form of power sharing with the current junta, or to destabilize them enough that we see potentially another coup that would unseat Goita, who's the current leader. And it's important to remember coups are not uh, something that is regimes are unfamiliar with. So just to point out, in Mali, there was a coup in 2020, there was a coup in 2021. So it's not unrealistic to think that if this continues, if the pressure continues from JNIM, we might see another coup from within the current junta.
So, I guess the question that I have, though, because you bring up an interesting point that it might not be an offensive that is geared towards seizing the capital city, but it might be a political ploy, either instigating a coup, reducing stability within the junta. Obviously, coups are inherently destabilizing, or leveraging this for political power. But I mean, I think if we're going to look at other conflict zones around the world and maybe an Al Qaeda affiliate, in at least historically in the past, I mean, I think what would come to mind to a lot of our listeners might be the Syria example, right? But now President al-Shara, though, he ditched when he was the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra, famously in 2016, he kind of distanced himself from al-Qaeda, created, his successor group, the HTS. And now, obviously, famously, he's just met with President Trump in the White House and really tried to distance themselves with Al-Qaeda. But JNAM, for all intents and purposes, I mean, they are the Al-Qaeda affiliate in West Africa. They have enormous amount of influence within the Al-Qaeda infrastructure and kind of the franchise. I mean, everything that we've seen and indicated is that JNAM is the primary, probably the most active Al-Qaeda affiliate. At least if you're analyzing it from territorial control, they're clearly the largest one, much more so than Al Shabaab, Boko Haram. So JNAM still clearly is tied to the Al Qaeda branding. Are you seeing any indications that they are leveraging that connection, or they're trying to distance themselves? Because everything indicates they're still Al Qaeda in the West Africa.
Yeah, I don't see any indication that they would be changing their alignment. Um, I also think in this case, it's sort of important to keep in mind that right now the current junta itself doesn't really have a lot of legitimacy internationally. We know that uh, there were several coups in the area, which I think is a good sort of baseline here to understand that Burkina Faso and Niger, the other two countries in the Sahel that sort of make up what's known as the tri-border region, where a lot of this unrest is happening. Um, have also experienced coups, and those three left the Economic Community of West African States, or ECOWAS, and formed sort of their own confederation, which is the Alliance of Sahel States, or AES. And so they already have sort of bucked this international legal and human rights framework. They left the ICC. So there's already a lack of legitimacy there. So I don't necessarily think that JNIM is feeling or would be feeling the pressure to legitimize themselves internationally. I think this is more about uh, showing that they are a political force within Mali. And who knows, we might see sort of that attitude shift in some of the other um, states like Burkina Faso or Niger.
And I guess so. So the key aspect though is when we're analyzing the territorial control that JNM does have, I said Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, even in these probably more remote areas and smaller urban centers that they do control. I mean, I'm assuming there is kind of a established government structure within JNM. I think a lot of people might compare it to kind of how the Taliban and Sharia law in Afghanistan. Are we seeing those types of government infrastructure in the territories that they do control? And is the concern for them that maybe Bamako is just too much for them to chew and they just don't want a deal with that scenario? Or what do you think is might be holding them back and not trying to seize the capital city? Or is this maybe another explanation could be they just don't want the international tension and trying to prevent the French or the Americans from coming back since the Russians really haven't been able to stop JNM's offensive in West Africa?
Well, they certainly don't want the Russians there because the Russians have been obviously at least attempting to interfere with their operations, though I think it's understood that the Russians are there for their own reasons and not as effective as the French were or as the Americans were. The Americans, when Niger fell to the current junta in a coup. The United States stuck around for a little while. I think we've talked about it before. There were two drone bases there, which were 101 and 201 in Niamey and Agadez. So the United States has lost that sort of projection into that region. They definitely don't want that coming back, but I think they see an opportunity to uh, disrupt the coup, have some form of negotiations with the current one, or like I said before, if they are successful in creating this unpopularity and there is another coup and there's a new regime that comes in, and they were the cause of that transition, I think they think that they would be in a pretty good position to have some sort of negotiations or power sharing. So that would be the fear. Territorially, the I wouldn't say it's much in terms of the way we think of government institutions that they're providing. What we do see is them collecting rent or rents. So one of the common things that they do is they would set up sort of checkpoints or roadblocks and then collect tolls and tax uh, people in transit. And that's actually something we saw in Syria as well. Like that is a significant revenue stream for a lot of these organizations.
So let me just focus on the Russian piece. How much, because you're highlighting how the Russians haven't been, as an effective counterterrorism partner for Mali compared to the French or the Americans or the Europeans as a whole. I mean, based on your observations in Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali, I mean, are you seeing the Africa Corps, which again was the successor organization from Wagner that took over operations in West Africa? Are you seeing the Africa Corps really doing much to halt? I mean, how would you rate their effectiveness against JNM and the ISIS affiliate in West Africa known as the Islamic State of the Sahel province?
Well, I don't think they're very effective at all. I think one of the things, especially in the beginning, but there's I don't have a sense that this has really changed. Uh, a lot of that is more for sort of the close protection of the junta themselves, and protecting the interests of the junta. I, for a little while, was thinking, and I know I've said this before, that maybe Russia had interest in some of the uh, natural resources, specifically bauxite. I haven't followed up on that as much as I should have, but no, I don't think they're very effective, and I don't think that it's necessarily their goal. That being said, I do think one of the reasons that we're seeing this current strategy from JNIM is because they're seeing that this is sort of a low risk, high reward. They're able to target a lot of these fuel transports, and that is causing great pain in Bamako. But in doing that, they're avoiding any sort of like pitched battles that they would have a greater chance of losing. So this tactic uh, is particularly hard for the current regime, and with the backing of the Russians to combat.
So you're seeing more of, let's say, an economic blockade against the junta, more so than a lightning offensive to seize the capital. Is that correct?
Yeah, that seems to be the primary tactic here, is to starve the capital of fuel and power, and potentially expose the junta's inability to protect sort of the basic um, economic life in the capital city.
And kind of to focus a little bit more on the Sahel region. I mean, JNM then, I guess one of their biggest adversaries in the groups that they fight a lot is kind of the ISIS affiliate that I mentioned earlier, the Islamic State in the Sahel provinces, previously known as the Islamic State in the Greater Sahel. I mean, the Islamic State Sahel province JNM conflict is a very intense battle right now that's also going on in Niger, Burkina Faso, and Mali. I mean, is it crazy to say that maybe JNM might view the Islamic State in the Sahel province maybe as a more significant threat compared to, let's even say, the Russians or JNM, the Russians or Mali, or is the Islamic State in the Sahel province a minor player when you're analyzing it compared to JNM's other adversaries in the regions?
So I don't necessarily know if they see them as a bigger threat. In fact, I would say they don't. So we saw pretty heavy fighting from 2019 and 2020 between the two. And then we see sort of a lull. Then there was major fighting in eastern Mali. Uh, and that was also involving the Tuareg groups, they had this strange relationship where JNIM and the Tuaregs were kind of taking on ISGS together. And then we saw another lull in 2024. And it seems like when we see a lull like that, it's really, we're seeing fewer direct clashes, and almost simultaneously both groups sort of turning their focus more on the state forces. Though we have seen sort of a resurgence of that fighting in places like Dori, or Burkina Faso. And it's not as intense, I would say, as what we've seen in the past. Uh, and I think the main reason for these conflicts between the two groups is really a lot of competition over sort of territory and revenue, both sort of trying to establish the same smuggling routes. And we see this sort of bleed out across the Sahel, in this trans-Sahel trade that stretches all the way to, say, Sudan. And that is one of the big concerns about these groups, and why there's such a big fear about the spillover into the Gulf states. That's the Gulf of Guinea, because gaining access gives them a much easier route to the sea, which is obviously the easiest way to smuggle illicit goods and increase their revenue.
And for the illicit goods piece, I do observe a lot of the drug trafficking organizations in South America leverage West Africa to smuggle mostly drugs, specifically cocaine, up to Europe. Is this one of the areas that you see that both either JNAM, Islamic State in the Sahel province, and other groups might battle for control to kind of tax those routes, specifically the drug routes going up to Europe?
Honestly, that wouldn't surprise me at all. I don't think either group is one to leave money on the table. And we've seen, even though it might seem counterintuitive, we've seen that type of action taken by these Salafist groups in the past. So it really, again, I don't see any reason that they would leave revenue on the table.
And kind of the last question related to the Sahel before we pivot to Nigeria. I guess my question for you in the Sahel, if you're looking at the alliance of Sahel states, the three major juntas being Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. I mean, it's obviously there's others such as Chad, but out of those, which of those juntas do you see having the least amount of stability, or where do you suspect, if you had to place a bet, where would you suspect, would be the first junta to fall? Is it, for example, Mali because of the situation going there? Is it Burkina Faso, where because they continues to get pummeled by Islamist groups? Which one do you think is more at risk right now?
Honestly, I think Mali is in a very precarious position right now. I think I think right now what we're seeing, especially with the presence of JNIM, Mali has long been sort of considered their home turf. Um, they're the furthest north and most removed, even prior to the juntas. A lot of you remember the Tongo Tongo incident in Niger. That was Salafist groups from over the border in Mali, sort of leaching into Niger. So I think it being the stronghold of JNIM and the fact that JNIM has sort of adopted this new strategy, and there's no one there to really push back at the moment. And we at one point considered Mali sort of like this weak but reformable partner. But it has really turned into sort of an insurgent siege against the authoritarians in Bamako, and they're Russian aligned, but the Russians have enough on their plate right now, especially with Ukraine, and I think they're obviously spread a little bit thin. Um, I don't see anyone necessarily being in a position to come to the aid of the government in Bamako.
Sorry, I do have to ask this. Is there a universe where you see the French recommitting troops to the Sahel, or has that ship sailed? And if Mali falls, or there's another coup and there's even more increased instability, is there a scenario where, just as we did with the Kurds in Syria, we're going to have to rely on the Tuaregs for counterterrorism operations from a distance? I mean, what's the future like if the Mali junta does fall?
So if you're asking about the French restarting Operation Barkhane, I think that would be very, very difficult. Um, it was fairly substantial. There's a lot of logistics that go into that. Um, and we saw that, the MINUSMA mission ended basically, and that was the UN mission in Mali, that ended because the French left. And the French also relied on the United States. They shared the air base down in Niamey in Niger, and they relied on the support and reconnaissance from the United States coming out of those two air bases. There would have to be a lot of work to spin that back up. That said, there does seem to be a sense of, I guess you could call it responsibility that the French feel towards some of their former colonies. I think there has been an interest in the United States to be able to get more insight into what's going on there through reconnaissance, but also uh, being able to sort of affect the situation on the ground. And that's why you saw, special forces from the United States operating in the Sahel. And that's lessons learned because, as we talked about, they do have quite a bit of territory in that area. And what happens when Al Qaeda has territory where they're allowed to act, if they still subscribe to this concept of the United States being the far enemy, as Osama bin Laden put it, which is one of sort of the reasons we saw 9/11 in the first place, was because they had this perspective that the United States was the far enemy, and they had the space to plan an elaborate attack against the United States. So if you have funding and you have territory and you have a lack of intelligence on what they're doing, that's dangerous. And so I do think that the French and the United States have a vested interest in trying to maintain um, some level of presence in the area. Right now, that means operating from outside of the Sahel. But if they see an opportunity to gain a foothold, I wouldn't be surprised if we saw something start sort of on a smaller scale. But I cannot imagine right now what that would look like.
And just to follow up on the question I asked, the Tuareg, specifically, kind of the main group being the Azawad Liberation Front, or ALF, and the other acronym being FLA in French. What role are they playing? I know this was a merger of various Tuareg groups, and they do appear to receive support for Ukraine because the ALF has done a lot of battles against the Mali junta and specifically Wagner and the Africa Corps. What is their relations to kind of JNM and ISIS and Greater Sahel? Are they kind of taking arm length and not be really interested in that battle? Is there an opportunity that they might be a primary counterterrorism partner comparable to the Kurds in Syria? Again, we do know the Ukrainians have supported them to fight the Russians there. What is the Azawad Liberation Front? What is their perspective? What are you seeing right now in the relationship with JNM?
I mean, I think they're still somewhat fragmented, and in sort of like a regrouping stage. Um, I don't see them ever being as reliable as a group like the Kurds. And I think, the really like what they're most focused on is survival and sort of preservation of their identity. I don't, we've seen them, like I mentioned before, in this sort of alliance with JNIM briefly to sort of rebuff the Islamic State in the Greater Sahel. Um, so no, I don't see them being the most effective. But I could see obviously the United States working with them before they would uh, JNIM, obviously.
And now pivoting to Nigeria, I mean, it was kind of an interesting dynamic where President Trump, and I think a lot of this was kind of the power of social media, and then kind of conservative media really pushing the narrative of kind of the targeting of Christians in Nigeria. You know, I think a lot of people are highlighting the deaths of Christians in Nigeria and kind of the targeted attacks against them. They're trying to conflate that, I think, with the situation related to Boko Haram and ISIS in West Africa, because I think you and I both know Boko Haram's and ISIS West Africa's strongest presence is around the Lake Chad Basin, which is northeast of Nigeria. Um, predominantly Muslim territory, not really close to kind of more of the mid belt area of Nigeria where you see that kind of ethnic conglomerations. But before we go to kind of the specific the Christian, I think it is important to highlight, just as we alluded to the ISIS Greater Sahel and JNM conflict. I mean, ISIS West Africa and Boko Haram, which Boko Haram is the Al Qaeda affiliate. I mean, they're having intense clashes right now in the Lake Chad Basin. What's the latest situation that you're seeing there? And obviously, since the French pull out, the multinational joint task force hasn't really been effective anymore in the Lake Chad Basin. It looks like it's just Nigeria right now trying to fight both groups. What are you seeing in that region? Is this a situation where Nigeria is taking a step back and let ISIS, West Africa, and Boko Haram kind of battle each other out?
I don't think it's a situation where Nigeria is taking a step back. They have, for a very long time, had a lot of trouble maintaining any sort of control over that northern portion, really northeastern portion of the state. And we've seen this, they've had trouble sort of enforcing laws in places like Maiduguri. Um, I wouldn't say that they're taking a step back. Um, what we are seeing, I think, is something similar to what we saw or what we were talking about in the Sahel when it comes to clashes between Al-Qaeda affiliates and Islamic State affiliates, because there has been pressure uh, from both the larger Islamic State and the larger sort of Al-Qaeda organization, if you could call it that, um, to end what they consider an anomaly, where there's been sort of a level of relative peace between those groups, uh, ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates, specifically in the Sahel. So I think there's a larger push right now, again, over territory and revenue. And the Lake Chad Basin really does play a role again in this trans-Sahel sort of trade network that I was mentioning before. So it's not surprising that we're seeing clashes there. I just don't think Nigeria uh, has developed any sort of means or uh, tactic to really get into that part of the country and quell the violence.
Yeah, and I think the situation. I mean, look, I think it's important to note. I mean, we do know Boko Haram. I think it's important for our listeners to have targeted Christians in various significant terrorist attacks. But the area of operation and the center of operation of Boko Haram is in northeast Nigeria, which is predominantly Muslim, and they inflict casualties on everybody of all faiths, regardless if they're Christian or Muslim. And I'll go, although again, it's important to highlight that Boko Haram has targeted Christians. I think that a lot of the violence and where the Trump administration is really focusing on the attacks on Christians, it's more related to the situation with Fulani tribes and the herders, kind of with droughts going on in North Africa and continue to push further south. You're seeing a lot of Fulani herders, continue to graze further south in more traditional Christian areas, and that what we're seeing is more agrarian conflict and ethnic conflict that doesn't necessarily kind of draw necessarily within a religious context, but it's more because of social economic situations within Fulani tribes, herders trying to push their cattle further south, encroaching on more Christian, known territory areas where they are based out of. And the kind of the ethnic tensions that cause is not necessarily a religious component per se, but much more complex, and kind of also highlighting the weakness of the Nigerian state to try to maintain stability and kind of this monopoly of violence that clearly Nigeria does not have. And I think the Trump administrations and the way they're framing it, is not necessarily conducive to kind of what if you would talk to somebody from Nigeria in the situation that's actually going on the ground. I mean, this isn't a scenario where we know, for example, that the violence that's happening in the Middle Belt region is because of Boko Haram. The vast majority of that is because of Fulani, which are traditionally Muslims. Agrarian conflict that has really had an intense level of spillovers. But unfortunately, that is a situation that is all too common across Nigeria and ethnic tensions that go there. And a lot of it has much more to do with from a social economic perspective rather than a religious dimension. And I mean, again, the Trump administration and President Trump has talked about it significantly, although in the last couple of weeks, we haven't really seen much more focus on that. But I think it is an interesting aspect where, we've talked about this and we've seen the reporting where historically, under the second Trump administration, there was conversations where U.S. AFRICOM might be dissolved and kind of reincorporated under U.S. European Command. But it looks like the situation, not only in Nigeria, but in the Sahel and more importantly in Somalia, really gave a meaning for AFRICOM to exist. And I think it's important to note that out of all the areas where the United States military is conducting strikes, I think Somalia is the most active one right now, much more so than what we see even in Iraq and Syria, or even with these new named operations in South America against these quote unquote narco terrorists. AFRICOM does do a lot of missions in Somalia, and it does look like the question if AFRICOM was going to go away has been settled. And even with the situation in Nigeria and the focus there with the Christians, it does look like, Matt, that AFRICOM is here to stay for the second Trump administration.
Yeah, I and I know that you've mentioned that before, like when we were talking offline. I guess I wasn't too concerned about AFRICOM disappearing. I think they stay out of a lot of the limelight. And that's probably due to sort of like the United States, the population in the United States not paying as much attention to what's going on in Africa. And that is where a lot of this rhetoric right now surrounding Nigeria is very dangerous because this really isn't like an ethnic or religious conflict, though there are undertones specifically talking about the violence that I believe they were citing. Like you said, these are farmer herders. It's really over agriculture, which makes up a significant portion of Nigeria's GDP. And so this is a resource conflict. And that also ties into sort of what we were talking before, where we are seeing a shift, especially like I said previously in Mali, but also here in the Lake Chad basin where um, they're intentionally moving towards uh, a governance by taxation. That's what ISWAP is trying to achieve. To some extent, what Boko Haram is trying to achieve. They run these rackets on the fishing communities and the trade routes, and that is basically how they fund themselves in large part. So there are two different things at play here, both of them very much tied to agriculture. And I think it's doing a real disservice to the people in Nigeria who are our allies to be framing it in this way. Because by framing it this way, we're ignoring sort of the underlying causes of this violence and of this problem. And we're already pulling away when it comes to funding of Nigeria. That's dropped by, I think, something like 40%. So we're not really doing anything constructive here. And it could be very dangerous in the long term.
And I guess the kind of interesting topic that we're kind of seeing with Africa as a whole is that I think with the average American, when we talk about Al Qaeda and the Islamic State, I think they immediately think of the Middle East or Afghanistan. But what we're really seeing is the growth of these groups across the Africa continent. I mean, we've highlighted the Sahel region, we've highlighted Nigeria, we've highlighted Somalia, but they also have a presence. I mean, ISIS specifically is known to operate in the Congo, in the Democratic Republic of Congo, in a smaller way, Mozambique. I mean, Africa does seem to be a major focal point for a lot of these Salafist organizations, and probably the most intense conflicts between Al Qaeda and the Islamic State. Even when we've seen that both historically in Syria, then we saw that in Afghanistan, the vast majority of those conflicts is going on in Africa. I mean, it does look like we haven't really been able to turn the tide on these Salafist organizations in Africa. And if anything, these groups are continuing to gain strength and they're battling each other more in Africa than in other parts of the world. Is there any way that the rise of these Salafist organizations can be halted in the Africa continent, or is the United States and the West reprioritizing other geopolitical priorities, enabling these groups to continue to spread in Africa almost unabated?
I mean, that's a really good question and a really difficult one to answer. I think local partners are the most important aspect of that. And we saw whatever projection we had into the Sahel, which was quite a bit and really wasn't on the radar of a lot of Americans back at home. But we lost that when Russia started exerting sort of anti-Franco sentiment and was supporting ultimately this string of coups that we saw in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. And we lost those partners effectively. And that's why what I was alluding to with Nigeria is counterproductive because we risk losing or souring a relationship with another ally in that region. Um, And to that point, you're pointing out again, like most people think of the Middle East when, it's more concentrated there. I think there are sympathies in some of the governments to those organizations, but we see them largely they're much more powerful in some of these places in Africa. And I think another one to look at is the Philippines. Not a lot of people talked about Abu Sayyaf. Not a lot of people talked about the MILF, the Moro Islamic Liberation Front, or the Moro Nationalist Liberation Front. Then again, we're seeing sort of this conflict between Al-Qaeda backed affiliates and Abu Sayyaf, the Islamic State backed affiliate. And we're not seeing as much coordination as I was expecting with the new Marcos government there. Um, so yeah, it does seem like we're not focused as much on uh, terrorism, specifically Salafist terrorism, as the United States has been in the past. So that could potentially come back and bite us. And I also worry about some of the damage that we're doing in terms of intelligence sharing when it comes to these groups. And we have lost a lot of the collection capabilities in those areas.
And to kind of finish this episode, I do want to talk about the situation in Sudan. I mean, we've had previous of our episodes kind of mentioning this. The Rapid Support Forces. They recently seized the town of El Fasher. We did cover that in one of our previous episodes. I mean, the videos out of Darfur right now are absolutely horrendous. I mean, I think the casualties are right now, it's kind of hard to pinpoint in the tens of thousands. The last report from the United Nations that we got is that close to 90,000 civilians have fled. Because of the Rapid Support Forces (RSF) seizure of the town. It looks like the Darfur region is seeing another wave of genocide, similar to what we saw in the early 2000s with the Janjaweed. Um, I guess my question for you, Matt, is: are we seeing the Rapid Support Forces continue to fight because of internal support, or do you believe that the United Arab Emirates and leveraging their allies with Chad have played a key role in supporting the Rapid Support Forces, and that's the reason why Al Fasher fell and the Sudanese armed forces had to pull out of the Darfur region, where unfortunately it looks like we're seeing a repeat of the Darfur genocide?
Yeah, I think the support from the UAE is a major factor here. We were talking the last time we spoke about this, I'd mentioned that is one of the areas where the United States, with its relationship with the United Arab Emirates, could apply some legitimate pressure here. They have been funneling weapons to the RSF, including the SAM system that took down one of the SAF's planes. They they are in part responsible here, even though, they're denying it. It does seem fairly evident. And what we're seeing is terrifying. It's horrible, the situation on the ground. And it's targeted killings in Al Fasher, but we're also seeing that extend and have larger ramifications because there is a famine, and this is going to kill people far beyond the borders of that city or outside of the conflict. Um, so the situation there is dire. And we also talked about things to watch, and it does seem as though the RSF is pushing east and looking at the fighting around the city of Bara.
I guess the question is, I think when Khartoum, the capital of Sudan, when the Sudanese armed forces kind of retook the entire capital, it looked like that maybe the Rapid Support Forces, maybe not to the extent that had their days numbered, but we're definitely on the losing side. Are we in a situation where you're seeing more of a stalemate, or are you seeing the RSF now have the upper hand in their conflict with the Sudanese armed forces?
Yeah, I think the RSF has the upper hand at this point. I think as we see them continue to push east, uh, I'm not sure what the armed forces, Sudan's armed forces, could do at this point. They're clearly on the back foot. And I think the reason that they pulled out of El Fasher when they did was for fear of losing those who were defending El Fasher. So hopefully they got enough people out in that they are able to present some sort of resistance to the RSF, but that is not going to do anything for sort of the collapse of humanitarian operations or the expanding famine. So until there's some sort of ceasefire, um, I don't know how that can be rectified. And when there is a ceasefire, who and how is the RSF going to be held responsible for these actions?
I find it interesting how the RSF and the UAE's justification for support of the RSF operations is framed in this anti-Islamist um, narrative, which couldn't be further from the truth in many aspects. Not really a key component of their ways, and definitely not something that justifies what they're doing in Darfur, which is more kind of this pan-Arabism and genocide against the civilians in Darfur. And unfortunately, this is another case where the international community has just completely turned a blind eye. We did see Secretary of State Marco Rubio did allude to the possibility that if it is would enhance the possibility of peace, they might declare the Rapid Support Forces as a foreign terrorist organization. But we haven't really seen much. I know the U.S., from a diplomatic sense, has tried to really negotiate a ceasefire between the Sudanese armed forces and the Rapid Support Forces, but that is a conflict that continues to escalate with no end in sight. And unfortunately, it highlights a key problem set in the Africa continent where crises are spreading, but the international community is not paying attention. And unfortunately, a hotspot might pop up somewhere else around the world. And Africa always is at this point is at the bottom of priorities for most countries around the world. I mean, just recently we saw Thailand and Cambodia have clashes against along the border. Smaller scale clashes. The Thai Air Force threatened, well, not even threatened. They declared that the ceasefire and peace treaty agreement that Thailand and Cambodia signed with President Trump is null and void because of tensions with Cambodia. Cambodia has threatened to retaliate against Thai airstrikes that they claimed killed Cambodian citizens. And when those conflicts happen anywhere around the world, any focus and attention, however small, is given to Africa just completely dissipates. And I think that is where we continue to see instability grow across the Africa continent. I mean, I know in this episode, for the most part, we covered Al Qaeda and ISIS affiliate groups. We did cover Sudan, but we didn't even touch upon the situation in the Eastern Congo and the Democratic Republic of Congo, or the crisis in Sudan, South Sudan. I'm sorry, and that, I think, is the problem. Is the international community is just not there anymore. I think 10 years ago there was a lot more focus on Africa, a lot more diplomatic pressure in Africa, a lot more military assets in Africa to try to at least keep the situation from spiraling. But that, I think, those days are long and gone, and the Africa continent is going to continue to suffer violence and conflict and no end in sight. And the situations that we highlighted here just epitomizes that. And we'll see what happens in the Sahel. We'll see what happens in Nigeria. We'll see what happens in Sudan. But I think one thing is certain is that the situation will more likely deteriorate before it gets better. But with that, Matthew, I really want to thank you for your time today and talking this episode. This has been the Bottom Line Up Front, an Artorias podcast.